Hello YouTube. Here's another episode of Cast Iron Savvy. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to castironsavvy@gmail.com. Help us get some ideas on what you'd like for us to cover, what's some cast iron collecting questions that you have. It doesn't necessarily have to be on any particular, brand or, anything. We're not limited. I cover a lot of Griswold, Wagner, Ware, Favorite, Wallpack, those types of things. But you're welcome to, send some questions, about some Western Foundry or BS&R or Lodge or something like that. And if we think that we can help out, we'll either give you a reply, individually, or we'll create an episode about it. And then, of course, hit the subscribe button below so that you'll be notified whenever we get some new episodes posted. So today I'd like to share some thoughts of mine regarding how cast iron was actually made. Most of the cast iron that we collect today was, primarily made 100% by hand. There was, really very few machines involved, as much as machines had to be involved in, working with molten iron. It primarily was truly made by hand, and that's why one of the reasons that I truly like it so much, because I feel it is, in part an art form. These were very skilled craftsmen that helped create, some of this beautiful cast iron, that we collect. This is called a sand rammer, or commonly a sand tamper. And this particular one was found in Pennsylvania. I'm not for sure exactly which foundry it came from. There are several in Pennsylvania, but this is where this one was found. They're all pretty much identical, regardless, what foundry or part of the country you find these in. This is very typical. It have a round end on one side and a tapered end on another side. This is very typical of sand rammers in the industry. This one looks like it has arrows pointing a certain direction. Probably the person that put them there 100 years ago is the only one that knows what they meant by that. And this is kind of unique. Most of them do not have this brass piece put on the end. I don't know if this was a worker modification to keep the end really straight and crisp, rather than flaring out as as the end of a piece of wood would over time in use. But this one's got a nice nice brass cap on it, and they would create a pattern, and that pattern would be created out of either carved of wood, possibly of zinc. Many times they'd use brass, and they would machine, mill, carve that particular pattern into the shape they wanted. Sometimes it was multiple pieces that was used to create a pattern, and then either cast separately and then put together, or then they would use the different pieces of the pattern, put them together, and then cast a single piece. And that pattern then would be packed with casting sand in a mold that they refer to as a flask, and it typically had a top half and a bottom half, and those have individual names too, but I'm not going to go into all that. It's very similar looking. If you have ever seen a beehive, it's very similar to the supers of a beehive in how that process worked. And they would fill the bottom half with sand, and put the pattern in it, and pack the pattern with sand on top, and then flip it over and do the opposite. So eventually then you had two halves, and they took the pattern out, and that pattern was used over and over and over again. They take the pattern out, and then you would have a sand mold, and then you'd fill the sand mold cavity with molten iron, and you would cast. Then you'd have a sand casted iron piece after you were done. So anyway, there's multiple details behind that whole process that you can read on, and I'll try and post. I've seen a couple of them, videos on YouTube that I thought were good representations of the actual process that some of the Griswold and Wagner and favorite workers would have gone through, in creating, the different pieces of cast iron. And I'll try and post a link to one of those down below. I've seen one where a gentleman was making an aluminum skillet in his backyard but the process was exactly the same. You just have to imagine in your mind that that's what that worker would have done all day long in making these sand molds, and then someone would have come along with a crucible full of molten iron, pour it in, you would let it cool, and then you'd break away the actual sand mold. So the molds were never used twice. It was impossible, because you would break the mold to get the finished piece out. It was the pattern that was not made of cast iron, or I guess it possibly could have, but typically it was made of some softer material that you could carve or work with, and that was used over and over and over again. And I picture in my mind these patterns in a manufacturing environment, especially back then. Maybe they had dirt floors, and stuff like that. But I always wonder, because I see a lot of it looks like manufacturing errors or flaws on some of these pans that are virtually otherwise like new, and they may be warped, or have what looks like dents in them. Well, those dents very well could have been caused by someone using this hand rammer a little too aggressively on those patterns, and denting them, and and then the next day that dent's going to be there in every one of those subsequent pieces that they made. I often wonder, because I know that thing, I've worked in manufacturing, I know how things, work, and when you're going at a fast pace, a lot of those people were paid by the number of pieces that they could, turn out in a day. I can imagine that those patterns, were, although they were very expensive to make, that they did suffer some damage, and of course even through wear had to be replaced. So speaking of that, here's a couple skillets that I just pulled out of my iron pile over here. This is what was Griswold considered the pattern number. And there's really no rhyme or reason to these pattern numbers on Griswold. I often wonder that too, if they just didn't start in one section of the warehouse where they kept their patterns and just started numbering, around the wall. And so if they said, okay, make me, 100 of, pattern 701, that they would know exactly where to go get it. Whereas, Wagner Ware had a little different approach, and the actual, numbers mean something. They correspond to, the either the size or the shape of the item that they were, referring to. So anyway, this is called the pattern number. This is 701, and it just happens to be a number seven skillet. And there's no other letters or numbers, with this. So this was probably, the main pattern that was used in the production of this particular type skillet. Here we have a number 5. Large block logo, and it has an A. Now, I've watched these pieces, for a couple years now, and I've not seen a 724 large block number 5 without this A. So this, leads me to believe that, either something happened to that pattern, and they quit using it early on, or they just started with A. I don't know. I'm not even going to speculate, but every one of the large block number fives that I've seen all have this pattern letter A on it. So this is 724. That just means it's a number 5 regular skillet, and then it's patterned A. So, as you have orders coming in from all across the country for, different numbers of skillets, you're going to have numerous patterns, going at the same time in order to keep up with production. There's a number 9. This just happens to be a Griswold large block regular skillet, and it has a pattern letter K. So 710 represents number 9 regular skillet, and they used that for a long time. They started standardizing these pattern numbers after the Erie series, because in the Eries you can have the exact same number 9 skillet with multiple pattern numbers. And then I can only speculate it. At some point they decided, okay, let's just keep a number 9 skillet, regular skillet, as a 710, and then instead of going 711, 712, 713 for all the various number 9s, we're going to add this letter under it. And so this is the K is the 11th letter of the alphabet, if I counted correctly. And then you would also possibly have one that didn't have a letter at all, 710. So, here you can speculate that, they probably had at least 11 or 12 patterns of this number 9 skillet all going, at multiple times, various times at the same time, in order to fill production of the orders that are coming in. So that's what this letter here represents. I used to, when I first started collecting, I used to think, well, this really wasn't, if it had a letter down here, it really wasn't the true thing, that I wanted all of mine matching with just this pattern number alone, no letter. Well, then what happens when you get to the number 5 and you can't find one that just has a 724? They all have the A on it. Well, then what are you going to do? So, and then as I, matured in my collecting, I realized that, hey, this is just, part of the manufacturing process, and it's interesting, interesting to have the various different, pattern letters in your collection. Number 8 was a very popular skillet size, as I'm sure you probably know, and you can get number 8s. They made so many different number 8 patterns that they actually had to start putting 2 letters together. So you can get an AC, and an AK, and BC, and all of that. You can, they started doubling up on these because they had so many patterns going, at the same time, and I can just, picture, several people working on, maybe 10 or 15, number 8 patterns at a day, and maybe something would happen to one pattern and have to take it out, and have it remade, and during that time you'd have to get another one, off the shelf in order to keep going. So there's a lot of things if you just think about the manufacturing processes, especially during that time. And here's another little thing I'd like to point out. This is a Griswold coffee trivet, and it's pattern number 1738, and this one has a small 4. So this is a little bit different in that this is a fairly small item, and so for efficiency purposes, the pattern for this would actually have consisted of at least 4 of these, because this is a 4, and each one of them would have had a different number. So 1, 2, 3, 4 possibly. So this was kind of a quality control measure as well, so that when these items were inspected, they found some errors, some manufacturing flaws with one, they could go back and easily determine that, hey, this number 4 spot on this pattern, is got something wrong with it. We need to investigate this. And possibly too, that they could have had, as far as like this particular one here, pattern K, they could have actually even assigned different patterns to workers. And so, if some bad pieces started coming out with this K, and they go back and look at the pattern's fine, well then, who was using that pattern that day. And then they could go back and, and look at that as well. And, that's just been speculation that, it wasn't my ideas, some different ideas that I've heard, over the last couple of years. So, but it's really interesting. So if it's got a letter that's indicative of a individual pattern, if it's got a number, then that typically represents that the pattern had the pattern actually produced multiple pieces at once. And so, if you wanted to, you could collect this 1738 coffee trivet with a small 1, 2, 3, and 4, and there may have been 5 and 6 as well, but I would think that it would probably be 4 pieces to this pattern, but who knows. It makes it really fun, and there's so many different ways to collect. Just find what intrigues you, and if you can find some pieces that are all the same, but slight variations and differences, different pattern letters, different pattern numbers, collect however you want to collect. It's it's a fun hobby, and it's meant to be fun. And I know people will probably argue and and want to get into fights about these little different differences, and say, oh, it wasn't that way, blah blah blah. But that kind of takes the fun out of it. We need to be educated and know what we're investing money into, is my opinion. But don't get too consumed with this is the way it was, and no one else's opinion matters. I'm learning every day, just like everybody else, and I hope you found this episode a little bit insightful into the different patterns and how the cast iron was made. Here again, send us questions and comments, castironsavvy@gmail.com, and hit the subscribe button below. See you next time. Bye.